He took me into the woods, yelling that I was too soft. I thought he was such a real man, until I heard his son whisper that he was scared to go home, and he showed me the bruise. I was 12 when Uncle Joe decided I needed toughening up. My parents had just gone through a messy divorce, and I guess everyone thought I was becoming too emotional about it all. I'd cry sometimes when I thought no one was looking, especially when I heard my mom sobbing through her bedroom door at night. Uncle Joe lived about an hour away in this cabin he'd built himself, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to stretch on forever. The first time he took me out there, I was honestly excited. He had this reputation in our family as the guy who could fix anything, survive anything, handle anything life threw at him. He was my dad's older brother, and even my dad seemed to defer to him in that way younger siblings sometimes do, even as adults. Uncle Joe was the one everyone called when something needed doing, when Grandma's roof leaked, when Cousin Sarah's car broke down in the middle of nowhere, when anyone needed help moving furniture or chopping firewood. He picked me up on a Saturday morning in his beat-up truck that smelled like motor oil and pine needles. The radio was tuned to some talk show where angry men discussed things I didn't understand yet. He didn't say much during the drive, just occasionally glanced at me and shook his head like he was disappointed in what he saw. When we got to his place, he handed me a backpack that felt like it weighed as much as I did and pointed toward the tree line. That first day in the woods was unlike anything I'd experienced. Uncle Joe moved through the forest like he belonged there, pointing out tracks in the mud, showing me which berries were safe to eat, teaching me how to find north without a compass. But every time I stumbled or complained about being tired or hungry, his face would harden. He'd tell me that crying was for babies, that real men pushed through discomfort, that the world would eat me alive if I stayed soft. When I twisted my ankle stepping wrong on a root and started tearing up from the pain, he stood over me with his arms crossed and said I could either walk it off or find my own way back to the cabin. I was miles from anywhere, surrounded by trees that all looked the same, and the thought of being alone out there terrified me more than the throbbing in my foot. So I gritted my teeth and limped along behind him for the rest of the day, determined to prove I wasn't the weak kid he seemed to think I was. These trips became a regular thing throughout that summer and into the fall. Every other weekend, Uncle Joe would show up at our house and announce it was time for another lesson in becoming a man. My mom always seemed relieved to see me go, like she was grateful someone else was taking responsibility for turning her sensitive son into something stronger. I started to look forward to these adventures, even though they were brutal. There was something addictive about pushing myself past what I thought I could handle, about earning those rare moments when Uncle Joe would nod approvingly at something I'd done. He taught me to start fires without matches, to skin rabbits he'd caught in traps, to stay perfectly still for hours while waiting for deer to pass by. He showed me how to read the sky for weather changes and how to build shelter from fallen branches and leaves. But underneath all these practical skills was this constant message that emotions were weakness, that asking for help was failure, that real strength meant never showing vulnerability to anyone about anything. I started changing at home too. When my mom would try to talk to me about how I was handling the divorce, I'd brush her off and tell her I was fine. When friends at school would invite me to birthday parties or sleepovers, I'd make excuses because those things seemed childish now. I was becoming someone harder, more self-sufficient, and I thought that was exactly who I was supposed to be. But there was always something that bothered me about these trips, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Uncle Joe lived alone in that cabin, but he had a son who was a couple years younger than me, Billy. He'd show up sometimes when we were heading out or coming back from our wilderness adventures, but he never joined us. He'd just stand in the doorway or sit on the porch steps, watching us with these huge, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything but reveal nothing. Billy was small for his age, quiet in a way that went beyond shyness. He reminded me of a stray cat that had started hanging around our house after the divorce, always on the edges of things, always ready to disappear if anyone moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. When Uncle Joe would bark orders at me during our forest training, Billy would flinch like the words were being directed at him instead. I tried talking to Billy a few times, but he never said much back. He'd answer my questions with single words or just nods, keeping his eyes down like he was afraid of making eye contact. Uncle Joe would sometimes mention his son with this tone of disappointment, saying things about how Billy wasn't tough enough for outdoor adventures, how he preferred staying inside with books and games instead of learning real skills. The family barbecue happened in early October, when the leaves were just starting to turn and there was that crisp feeling in the air that made everything seem more vivid. My whole extended family was there, aunts and uncles and cousins I only saw a few times a year. Everyone gathered in Uncle Joe's backyard around the fire pit he'd built from river stones. He was in his element that day, telling stories about his latest hunting trip, demonstrating knot-tying techniques to anyone who'd watch, holding court like the king of outdoor wisdom. I felt proud to be there as his protege, someone who could now identify bird calls and track animals and start fires with flint and steel. Other relatives kept commenting on how much more mature I seemed, how much more confident, and I soaked up their approval like a plant that had been starving for sunlight. Uncle Joe even put his hand on my shoulder at one point and told everyone how I was turning into a real outdoorsman, and I felt like I was glowing from the inside. But as the afternoon wore on, I started noticing Billy again. He was sitting by himself on the back steps, picking at a plate of food that he wasn't really eating. Every time someone got loud or laughed too hard, he'd tense up. When Uncle Joe would gesture broadly while telling a story, Billy would lean away like he was expecting to get hit. It was subtle, the kind of thing you might not notice unless you were really paying attention, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Update 1. As the sun started setting and people began cleaning up and saying their goodbyes, I found myself alone with Billy for the first time in months. Everyone else was inside helping with dishes or out front loading leftovers into cars. Billy was still on those back steps, now completely alone, staring at the dying embers in the fire pit. I sat down next to him, not really sure what to say. The silence stretched between us for a long time, filled only by the distant sounds of family members chatting and car doors slamming. Finally, I asked him if he was okay, and he looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like he was trying to decide whether I was safe enough to trust with something important. That's when he whispered those words that changed everything. He was scared to go home. The way he said it, so quiet I almost missed it, made my stomach drop. I asked him why, and he hesitated for a long moment, glancing around to make sure no one could see us. Then he lifted the edge of his shirt just enough to show me his side. The bruise was enormous, spreading across his ribs in shades of purple and yellow and green that made it look like a sunset painted on his skin. But this wasn't the kind of bruise you get from falling off a bike or running into a door. This was the kind that comes from something much worse, something deliberate. I stared at it for maybe 3 seconds before Billy pulled his shirt back down, and in those 3 seconds, everything I thought I knew about my uncle crumbled. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to something like that? I was 14 and had never encountered anything like this before. All my wilderness survival training hadn't prepared me for this moment, for the sick feeling spreading through my chest, for the way Billy was looking at me like I held his whole world in my hands. He started talking then, still in that whisper, telling me things that made me understand why he was always so quiet, always so watchful. He told me about walking on eggshells in his own house, about never knowing what might set his father off, about bruises in places where no one would see them. He told me about lying to teachers when they asked about injuries, about making excuses when friends wanted to come over, about the way Uncle Joe would switch from charming family man to something much darker the moment they were alone. The worst part was how normal Billy made it sound, like he'd accepted that this was just his life. He wasn't crying or dramatic about it. He was just stating facts, the way you might describe the weather or what you had for breakfast. That matter-of-fact tone somehow made it even more horrible, like he'd been living with this for so long that it had become routine. I sat there listening to my cousin describe a version of my hero that I'd never seen, and I felt like I was falling down a deep hole. Everything Uncle Joe had taught me about strength and toughness suddenly looked different. All those times he'd pushed me past my limits, all those lectures about not being soft, I started wondering if this was what he meant. If this was his idea of making someone strong. When Billy finished talking, he made me promise not to tell anyone. He said it would only make things worse for him, that Uncle Joe had warned him about what happened to kids who couldn't keep family business private. But I couldn't stop thinking about that bruise, about the way Billy had flinched every time his father moved too quickly during the barbecue, about all the signs I'd been too blind to see. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Billy's face when he'd shown me that bruise, the resignation in his expression, like he'd given up hoping that anyone would help him. I kept thinking about all the wilderness survival skills Uncle Joe had taught me, and how none of them included what to do when the person who's supposed to protect you is the one you need protection from. The next morning, I tried to act normal around my mom, but she could tell something was wrong. She kept asking if I was feeling okay, if something had happened at the barbecue. I wanted to tell her, but I kept hearing Billy's voice asking me not to say anything, kept imagining how much worse things might get for him if I broke that promise. So I just told her I was tired and didn't feel like talking. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the image of that bruise. I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before, The way Billy seemed to shrink into himself whenever Uncle Joe was around, the way he'd apologize for things that weren't his fault, the way he never seemed to have friends over or go to other kids' houses. I remembered times when I'd thought Billy was just shy or antisocial, and now I wondered if there were other reasons he kept to himself. I also started thinking differently about my own experiences with Uncle Joe. Those times when he'd leave me alone in the woods to find my own way back. What if I really had gotten lost? Those nights when he'd make me sleep outside in freezing temperatures to toughen me up. What if I'd gotten hypothermia? I'd always seen these as character-building exercises, but now they felt more like controlled cruelty, like he enjoyed watching me struggle and suffer. The breaking point came about a week after the barbecue. I was at school, trying to focus on a math test, when I started thinking about Billy again. I realized I hadn't seen him around lately, not even in passing. Our schools were different, but we lived in a small enough town that you usually ran into family members at the grocery store or the library or just walking around downtown. But Billy seemed to have disappeared completely. That afternoon, instead of going straight home, I rode my bike over to Uncle Joe's cabin. I told myself I just wanted to check on Billy, to make sure he was okay. But when I got there, the place felt different somehow. The truck was in the driveway, but the cabin was completely silent. No sound of chopping wood or tinkering with tools or any of the usual noises that surrounded Uncle Joe's daily routine. I walked around to the back of the house and found Billy sitting alone on those same porch steps where he'd shown me the bruise. But this time, he had a fresh cut on his lip and what looked like the beginning of a black eye. He saw me coming and immediately tried to turn away, but it was too late. I'd already seen enough. This time, I didn't ask permission or wait for him to volunteer information. I sat down next to him and told him we needed to talk to someone about what was happening. He started shaking his head immediately, saying it would only make things worse, that his father had promised to send him away if he ever told anyone about their private family matters. But I could see the fear in his eyes, and it wasn't just fear of making his father angry, it was fear that he might not survive much more of this. Update 2. That night, I made the hardest decision of my young life. I went to my parents and told them everything Billy had shared with me. I described the bruise, the cut lip, the black eye, the way he flinched around his father. I explained how Uncle Joe's idea of toughening me up suddenly seemed connected to something much darker happening in his own home. My parents' reaction was exactly what Billy had predicted and what I'd feared. They didn't want to believe it. My mother kept saying there had to be some misunderstanding, that Uncle Joe had always been so good to our family, that he'd helped us through so many difficult times. My father got defensive, insisting that his brother would never hurt a child, that Billy was probably just clumsy or getting into fights at school. They made all the usual excuses that adults make when they don't want to face something uncomfortable. They talked about how Uncle Joe had a stressful life as a single parent, how he was doing his best in a difficult situation, how family discipline was different from abuse. They seemed more concerned about protecting Uncle Joe's reputation than protecting Billy's safety, and their reaction made me feel like I was going crazy. But I couldn't let it go. The image of Billy's bruised ribs haunted me, along with the memory of how small and frightened he looked on those porch steps. I started doing research at the school library, reading about child abuse, learning about warning signs that I now recognized in Billy's behavior. Everything I read confirmed what I already knew in my gut, that my cousin was in serious danger. Since my parents wouldn't listen, I decided to go directly to Billy's school. I'd never done anything like this before, had never challenged adults or inserted myself into situations that weren't technically my business. But Uncle Joe's lessons about being strong had taught me something he probably never intended, that real strength sometimes means standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. I showed up at Billy's middle school during lunch period and asked to speak with a guidance counselor. The woman who met with me was patient and kind, listening carefully as I explained the situation. Unlike my parents, she didn't immediately dismiss what I was telling her or make excuses for Uncle Joe's behavior. She asked detailed questions about what I'd observed, took notes, and explained that schools were required by law to report suspected child abuse. What happened next moved faster than I'd expected. Within a couple of days, social services showed up at Uncle Joe's cabin to investigate. I don't know exactly what they found there, but whatever it was convinced them that Billy needed to be removed from his father's custody immediately. One afternoon, I saw a social worker's car leaving the dirt road that led to Uncle Joe's place, and Billy was in the back seat with a small suitcase. The family explosion that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Uncle Joe showed up at our house that evening, angrier than I'd ever seen him. He pounded on our front door and shouted accusations that the whole neighborhood could hear. He called me a liar and a traitor, said I destroyed his family over childhood fantasies and misunderstandings. He threatened to sue us, to turn the whole extended family against us, to make sure everyone knew what kind of ungrateful, troublemaking kid I really was. My parents were caught in the middle, torn between their loyalty to Uncle Joe and their growing realization that maybe I'd been telling the truth all along. The evidence that social services had documented made it harder for them to maintain their denial, but they still seemed more upset about the family drama than relieved that Billy was finally safe. The worst part was the silence that followed. Uncle Joe stopped speaking to us entirely, and he made sure that other family members knew we were responsible for Billy being taken away. Some relatives took his side, believing his version of events where I was a vindictive kid who'd made up stories to get attention. Others weren't sure what to believe but stayed quiet rather than get involved in the messy situation. I felt completely isolated. At school, I couldn't concentrate on anything because I kept wondering if I'd done the right thing. At home, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. My parents kept asking if I was absolutely sure about what I'd seen, if maybe I'd misinterpreted something, if there was any chance I'd made a mistake that had torn our family apart. But then, about 3 weeks after Billy had been removed from his father's custody, I got confirmation that I'd made the right choice. Billy's foster mother called our house and asked if I could come visit him. She said he'd been asking about me, that he wanted to thank me for helping him, but wasn't sure if I'd want to see him after everything that had happened. When I arrived at his temporary home, Billy looked different than I'd ever seen him. He still had some fading bruises, but there was something in his posture that was new, a straightness in his shoulders, a way of making eye contact that he'd never shown before. He wasn't completely transformed or suddenly confident, but he looked like someone who could finally breathe freely. We sat in the foster family's backyard, and Billy told me what his life had been like since leaving his father's house. He was sleeping through the night for the first time in years, not waking up in terror every time he heard footsteps in the hallway. He was eating regular meals without worrying that showing hunger might be seen as weakness or selfishness. He was starting to remember what it felt like to be a kid, to laugh at things that were funny instead of constantly watching for signs of danger. More importantly, he was getting help. The foster family had connected him with counselors who specialized in helping children recover from trauma. He was learning that what had happened to him wasn't normal, wasn't his fault, and wasn't something he had to carry alone for the rest of his life. He was discovering that there were adults in the world who could be trusted, who wouldn't hurt him for showing vulnerability or asking for help. Billy thanked me that day, but he also apologized for putting me in such a difficult position. He said he understood that I'd lost family relationships because of what I'd done, and he felt guilty about the price I'd paid for protecting him. But I told him something I'd been thinking about for weeks, that learning to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something, was probably the most important lesson anyone had ever taught me. Final update. The aftermath of Billy's removal from his father's custody continued to ripple through our family for months. Uncle Joe never admitted to any wrongdoing, instead maintaining that he'd been falsely accused by a vindictive teenager who didn't understand proper discipline. Some relatives chose to believe him, creating a permanent rift in family gatherings and holiday celebrations. Others quietly reached out to my parents to say they'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how to address it. My relationship with my parents slowly began to heal as they processed what had really been happening. My mother eventually apologized for not believing me initially, admitting that she'd been so grateful to have Uncle Joe's help during the divorce that she'd ignored signs she should have recognized. My father had a harder time accepting that his brother was capable of hurting a child, but as more details emerged through the legal proceedings, he couldn't maintain his denial anymore. The most difficult part was learning to reframe everything Uncle Joe had taught me about strength and masculinity. All those wilderness survival skills were still valuable, but I had to separate the practical knowledge from the toxic philosophy that had accompanied it. Real strength, I was beginning to understand, wasn't about suppressing emotions or enduring pain in silence. It was about having the courage to speak up when something was wrong, even when everyone around you wanted to stay quiet. I stopped going on wilderness adventures for a while, needing space to figure out who I wanted to be without Uncle Joe's influence. Instead, I started volunteering at a local community center that offered after-school programs for kids from difficult home situations. Working with these children taught me more about genuine toughness than any forest expedition ever had. I saw kids who'd survived incredible hardships but still found ways to be kind, funny, creative, and hopeful. Billy thrived in foster care in ways that surprised everyone who knew him. His foster parents were patient people who understood trauma and gave him the space he needed to heal at his own pace. Slowly, he started participating in activities he'd never been allowed to try before, joining the school chess club, taking art classes, even making a few friends who didn't know anything about his complicated family history. About 6 months after he'd been removed from his father's house, Billy came to visit our family for the first time since the whole ordeal began. My parents were nervous about the visit, unsure how to act around him, but Billy seemed remarkably composed. He'd grown a couple of inches and gained some weight, but the biggest change was in his demeanor. He still wasn't the most outgoing kid in the world, but he no longer seemed to be bracing for impact every time someone spoke to him. During that visit, Billy pulled me aside and told me something that has stayed with me ever since. He said that for years, he believed there were two kinds of people in the world, those who were strong enough to hurt others, and those who were weak enough to get hurt. But now he was learning about a third category, people who were strong enough to protect others, even when it was difficult or dangerous or cost them something important. The legal case against Uncle Joe moved slowly through the courts. There were investigations, interviews, medical examinations that documented years of abuse that Billy had hidden from everyone. Uncle Joe eventually accepted a plea deal that involved mandatory counseling and supervised visitation rights, though Billy made it clear he had no interest in seeing his father until he was much older and only if he chose to do so. Some family members never forgave me for my role in exposing Uncle Joe's abuse. They felt I'd betrayed family loyalty, that I should have handled the situation differently, that I'd caused unnecessary drama over something that wasn't my business. These reactions taught me something important about how abuse persists in families, not just because of the abusers themselves, but because of all the people who enable the abuse by staying silent, making excuses, or prioritizing family reputation over child safety. But other relatives privately thanked me for having the courage to speak up. Some admitted they'd noticed troubling signs but hadn't known how to address them. Others shared their own stories of childhood experiences they'd never told anyone about, recognizing patterns in Uncle Joe's behavior that reminded them of their own trauma. As I got older, I began to understand that what had happened with Billy was part of a much larger pattern. Uncle Joe's approach to masculinity, the idea that real men suppress emotions, endure pain without complaint, and use force to maintain control, was connected to his willingness to hurt his own son. The same worldview that taught me to see sensitivity as weakness also taught him that his child was something to be dominated rather than nurtured. I started reading about different models of masculinity, learning about men who defined strength as the ability to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to admit mistakes, to show compassion. I discovered that some of the strongest people I knew were those who'd survived terrible experiences but still chose kindness over cruelty, openness over isolation, healing over revenge. By the time I graduated high school, Billy had been living with his foster family for almost 2 years. They'd begun the process of adoption, wanting to give him the permanent stability he'd never had before. Billy was doing well in school, had developed some genuine friendships, and was even talking about what he wanted to study in college someday. I saw him at my graduation party, and we had a chance to really talk for the first time in months. He told me he'd been following my volunteer work at the community center, that he was proud of how I'd channeled what happened with his father into something positive. He also said something that surprised me, that he was grateful for everything that had happened, even the painful parts, because it had led him to a better life than he'd ever imagined possible. Looking back now, I realized that the day Billy showed me that Bruise was the moment I really became an adult. Not because I learned to start fires without matches or track animals through the forest, but because I learned to recognize when someone needed help and found the courage to provide it, even when the adults around me failed to do so. Uncle Joe had tried to teach me that strength meant never showing weakness, never backing down, never admitting fear. But Billy taught me that real strength sometimes means being willing to appear weak if that's what it takes to protect someone else. Real courage isn't about enduring suffering in silence. It's about speaking up when you witness suffering, even if your voice shakes when you do it. The family dynamics never fully returned to what they'd been before. Some relationships were permanently damaged, while others became deeper and more honest than they'd ever been. But I learned that some kinds of family peace aren't worth preserving if they depend on keeping terrible secrets, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to stay quiet when someone is being hurt. Billy and I stay in touch regularly now. He's in college, studying social work, planning to spend his career helping other kids who were growing up in dangerous situations. He says that surviving his childhood gave him insights that he wants to use to prevent other children from going through what he experienced. He's turned his pain into purpose in a way that inspires me constantly. As for Uncle Joe, I haven't spoken to him since that night he showed up at our house shouting accusations. I heard through family members that he eventually completed his court-mandated counseling, that he claims to have learned from his mistakes, that he wants to rebuild relationships with family members who will have him. But I've never felt any desire to reconnect with him, and I don't think I ever will. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet that day, if I'd honored Billy's request not to tell anyone about the abuse. I imagine him still living in that cabin, still accumulating bruises and terror, still believing that his suffering was normal and inevitable. I imagine myself continuing to admire Uncle Joe's version of masculinity, never learning that there were better ways to be strong. But I didn't stay quiet, and that decision changed both of our lives forever. Billy got the safety and support he deserved, and I learned lessons about courage and compassion that shaped who I became as an adult. It wasn't the kind of strength Uncle Joe had tried to teach me, but it was the kind that actually mattered when someone's life was at stake. The scar that experience left on our family was deep and permanent, but scars sometimes form over wounds that needed to heal. And sometimes, the people brave enough to expose those wounds, even when it hurts everyone involved, are the ones who make real healing possible for the first time.